She rear-ended a black SUV at 2 a.m. The Mafia boss stepped out. "Now you owe me your life." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was 2 a.m. and Emily was driving home, exhausted from a long shift at the hospital. The rain had been relentless for the past hour, turning the road into a slick, treacherous mess. Her car's wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, and her tired eyes could barely focus. The headlights of her old sedan cut through the misty night, but even that felt like it was barely making a dent in the dense fog. She had been on the road for far too long, pushing herself to make it home after 12 hours of hospital work. She yawned, trying to fight off the sleepiness creeping up on her. Her mind wandered, and for just a second, she lost focus. That's when it happened. Her foot pressed too hard on the gas pedal as she tried to avoid slipping on the slick road, and in that moment of distraction, she didn't see the black SUV stopped ahead. The screech of her tires was drowned out by the deafening crash of metal hitting metal. Emily's heart skipped a beat as the impact threw her forward against the seatbelt. Her head snapped back as the airbag deployed with a violent pop. She sat there, stunned, for what felt like an eternity, the only sound the relentless patter of rain against the windshield. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt, the adrenaline starting to kick in. She opened her door and stumbled out onto the rain-soaked asphalt. She looked at the front of her car. It was totaled. The hood was crumpled, and steam rose from the damaged engine. The black SUV, however, looked almost untouched. It was just a dent in the back corner. Emily's heart raced. She didn't know what to do. She was in shock. She had just crashed into someone's car, in the middle of nowhere. It was too late for her to call for help. The thought of dealing with the police at this hour made her stomach turn. She could barely keep it together. Just as she started to panic, the sound of the SUV's door opening caught her attention. She turned, and a tall man stepped out. His black suit looked perfectly pressed, as if it had been freshly ironed just for this moment. His face was hard, a strong jawline and dark eyes that looked like they could pierce through her. He didn't seem concerned about the damage at all. Instead, he walked toward her with an unsettling calmness, as though this was just another day. His presence was commanding, his every step deliberate. She couldn't look away, even though every instinct in her screamed to run. "You rear-ended me," he said in a voice that was low, but firm. Emily could barely speak, her throat dry. She opened her mouth to apologize, but before she could get a word out, he spoke again, his tone colder this time. "Now you owe me your life," he said, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Emily froze, her mind racing to process what he had just said. "What?" she finally managed to ask, her voice shaky. He tilted his head slightly, as though he found her confusion amusing. "You heard me," he said simply, stepping closer. The rain didn't seem to touch him at all. Emily's mind spun. Who was this man? What kind of person would say something like that? Before she could even gather her thoughts, he gestured to the men standing by the SUV. They were dressed in dark suits, their eyes scanning the area like they were trained to do so. The man's words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. "You will come with me," he said, "and you will pay for what you've done. You belong to me now." The words stung her like a slap in the face. What was going on? Was she being kidnapped? Or was this some sick joke? Her pulse quickened, but she couldn't find the strength to fight back. His words were too powerful. She had no idea who this man was, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life would never be the same again. As Emily stood there in the rain, the words he had just spoken hung in the air like a heavy fog, impossible to ignore. "You belong to me now." Her heart pounded in her chest, the panic rising. She tried to take a step back, her feet feeling like they were stuck in mud. She glanced at the men who had appeared with him, tall, imposing, dressed in dark suits, and instinctively, she knew she couldn't run. Not now. Not with the way they were eyeing her, as though she were a prize to be claimed. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Emily said, her voice trembling but defiant. The man in the black suit took a step closer, his gaze never leaving her face. "You don't have a choice." He said it so calmly, as if this was all part of some prearranged plan, and for a brief moment, Emily felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand. "What do you want from me?" she finally managed to ask, her voice almost a whisper. "You crashed into my car. Now, you pay the price," he replied, his voice smooth, each word carefully chosen. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to gather some sense of control. "Aleandro Romano," he answered, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at her. "And you, Emily, are coming with me." "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. She didn't know who this man was or why he was doing this, but she could feel the danger surrounding him. It was in the air, in the way the men flanking him moved, in the coldness of his voice. "I don't even know you." "Exactly," he said, his lips curling into something that almost resembled a smile. "But that's about to change." He turned toward his men and nodded. One of them stepped forward, opening the door of the black SUV. The headlights cut through the dark, casting long shadows on the wet ground. Emily hesitated, torn between the fear of what might happen if she didn't comply and the burning desire to escape. But there was nowhere to run. There was no way out. Aleandro's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "You will come with me. It's not negotiable. Do you understand?" Emily opened her mouth to protest, but the way he looked at her, with that cold intensity, made her think better of it. His eyes said everything. He wasn't asking for permission. He was simply telling her how things were going to be. The men stepped aside, and she was left with no choice. Slowly, she walked toward the SUV, her steps hesitant, her body frozen with fear. As she climbed into the back seat, Aleandro slid in next to her, the scent of his expensive cologne filling the car. She didn't know where they were going, or what he intended to do with her, but everything in her told her to stay silent, to play along for now. "You're probably wondering what happens next," Aleandro said, his voice breaking the uncomfortable silence. "I'm sure I'm not the first person to tell you that life has a funny way of changing in an instant. One moment, you're just living your life, and the next," he paused, looking at her with a small, unsettling smirk, "you crash into a world you didn't even know existed." Emily swallowed hard. She didn't know what he was talking about, but she knew one thing for sure. She was way out of her depth. As the SUV sped through the rain-soaked streets, Emily watched the city pass by, her mind racing. Who was this man? What did he want with her? And why did it feel like she was about to be drawn into something far darker than she could have ever imagined? The car took a sharp turn, and she found herself looking up at the imposing gates of a mansion. Her heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any house. This was a fortress. The gates opened as they approached, and the SUV drove up a long, winding driveway. The mansion loomed in the distance, its lights casting an eerie glow against the night sky. They pulled up to the front door, and Aleandro stepped out, followed by his men. He didn't even look back at her. Emily hesitated for a moment before following, her legs shaky beneath her. She felt like a guest in a world she didn't belong to. As they entered the mansion, the interior was even more extravagant than she could have imagined. Marble floors, towering ceilings, and walls lined with paintings that looked as though they belonged in a museum. This wasn't just a home, it was a statement. Aleandro led her into a lavish living room, where a fire crackled in the fireplace. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You'll be staying here," he said simply. Emily opened her mouth to argue, but he cut her off. "For now, anyway. You'll learn your place soon enough." She took a step back, still unsure of what was happening. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" "Like I said, you'll learn," he replied smoothly. "But for now, let's just say that this is the beginning of a very long road for you, Emily. And whether you like it or not, you're a part of my world now." As he spoke, Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't know what this world was, but she had a sinking feeling she was about to find out in the worst way possible. "You're not leaving me again," he added, his voice low, a promise in his words. Emily swallowed hard, fear creeping up her spine. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life had just taken a very dangerous turn. The mansion felt like a different world. As Emily stepped inside, the towering walls and opulent decor seemed to mock her sense of reality. Everything about this place screamed power, wealth, and danger. The marble floors, the grand chandeliers, the paintings on the walls. All of it was designed to make anyone who entered feel small, insignificant. And now, she was a part of it. She had no idea how or why she had ended up here, but one thing was painfully clear. This was no ordinary situation. Aleandro had made sure of that. He had walked ahead of her without looking back, his footsteps echoing through the vast hall. The men who had followed him, dressed in black suits, silently moved to the corners of the room, as though they were stationed there for some unseen purpose. Emily stood still for a moment, her heart racing. She had to get a grip. She had no idea what was going on, but she couldn't afford to fall apart. She had been in dangerous situations before, working in a hospital where lives were on the line every day. But this felt different. Come on. Aleandro's voice broke through her thoughts. He was standing at the far end of the room, his posture relaxed but commanding. You might as well get comfortable. This is your new home. Emily's eyes flickered toward him, but she couldn't find her voice. She had so many questions, so many things she needed to say, but somehow, the words wouldn't come. She followed him as he led her into a sitting room that was larger than her entire apartment. A fire burned in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. Everything here seemed to be about control, dominance. Even the furniture, with its sharp angles and dark leather, felt like it was watching her, waiting. Aleandro motioned for her to sit on one of the chairs across from him, and she obeyed. Although her mind was still reeling from the crash, the words he had said, the fact that she was now in a place she didn't belong. She didn't know if she was supposed to be scared or angry, but one thing was for sure. She wasn't going to back down. She had survived too much in her life to let this man intimidate her. He sat down across from her, studying her with those cold, calculating eyes. I know you have questions, he said finally, his voice low, almost like a whisper. But before you ask, let me make something clear. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. You're here because I chose you. Because you are of value to me. Do you understand? Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Value, she repeated, her voice shaky. What does that mean? What do you want from me? He smiled, a cold, almost predatory smile. You'll learn soon enough, he said. But for now, let's just say that I'm not in the habit of letting go of what's mine. And right now you're mine. The way he said it made her blood run cold. She didn't know whether to be terrified or disgusted, but one thing was certain. She couldn't let him control her. I'm not yours, she said firmly, though the words felt weak even as she spoke them. Aleandro raised an eyebrow. Is that so? He said, his tone almost amused. You think you have a choice in this? You rear-ended me, and now you owe me. That's how this works. I'm giving you a chance to be useful. You're going to help me with something, and in return, I'll let you keep breathing. But remember, you're not leaving this place until I say so. Emily felt a surge of anger rise within her. She wasn't about to let him talk to her like this. You can't keep me here. I'm not some prisoner. You're not a prisoner, Aleandro corrected, his voice soft but menacing. Not yet. But make no mistake, Emily. I hold the power here. And right now, you're in my world. You play by my rules. Emily's breath caught in her throat. This man was dangerous. She had known that the moment she had seen him standing in front of her SUV, but now it was clearer than ever. He wasn't just a businessman or some random stranger. He was someone who operated outside the law, a man who could make people disappear without a second thought. She had no idea how she had gotten tangled up in his world, but she was certain of one thing. She had to find a way out. Aleandro leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning her face with an unreadable expression. You've got spirit, he said, his voice almost approving. I like that. It makes things interesting. Emily stared at him, trying to keep her composure. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. But inside, she was terrified. She had no idea what he wanted from her, but she knew one thing. He was going to make her pay for that crash. How? Exactly. She didn't know yet, but she was certain of one thing. Aleandro Romano was not the kind of man who took no for an answer. So, what's next? She asked, her voice cold, trying to hide the fear that was creeping up on her. Next, Aleandro repeated. Next, you start your new life here. And you begin to learn exactly what it means to be mine. The next few days felt like a blur for Emily. Everything had happened so fast, and she still couldn't quite process it. She had been thrust into a world that felt as alien to her as anything she had ever imagined. Aleandro's mansion, his men, the cold, calculating way he had taken control. It was all too much to take in. But one thing was clear. She was stuck. Every time she tried to leave or protest, the walls of his world closed in tighter. There was no way out. The first few nights were the hardest. Emily tossed and turned in the enormous bed, the silence of the mansion pressing down on her like a weight. She could hear the occasional footsteps of guards outside her door, the hum of the mansion's security system, but no sound from the world outside. It was as though she had been shut away, hidden from everything she knew. She tried to ignore it, to focus on anything that could take her mind off her situation, but it was hard when Aleandro's presence seemed to be everywhere. In the mornings, he would come into the sitting room where she was reading or pretending to do something productive, his eyes watching her with an unreadable expression. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were always cryptic, always reminding her of the power he held over her. "Are you getting comfortable?" he asked one morning, his voice low. Emily looked up, startled. She hadn't realized he was standing there. "Comfortable?" she repeated, confused. "You expect me to get comfortable in this place?" Aleandro's lips curled into a slight smile, though it was devoid of any warmth. "Comfortable might be the wrong word," he said, "but you will get used to it. You'll learn how to live here, how to be a part of my world." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine at his words. His world. She didn't want to be a part of it. She wanted to leave. But every attempt she made to assert herself was met with resistance. One evening, as she was sitting by the window, staring out at the grounds of the mansion, one of Aleandro's men, a tall figure with dark hair and a sharp jawline, came into the room. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her. Emily turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. "Aleandro wants to see you," the man said simply. Emily's stomach dropped. She had been avoiding him for the past couple of days, not wanting to deal with whatever plans he had for her. But she knew it was pointless. She had to face him eventually. She nodded stiffly and followed the man down the long, dimly lit corridors of the mansion. The closer she got to his study, the more her nerves tightened. She had no idea what to expect from him. The last time they had spoken, he had made it clear that she was his, that she owed him. But she didn't know what he meant by that. What did he want from her? When she entered his study, Aleandro was sitting behind a large mahogany desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't look up as she entered, but the room felt charged with tension. "Sit," he said, his voice calm but firm. Emily hesitated, then took a seat across from him, her back stiff. "What is it now?" she asked, her voice colder than she intended. Aleandro finally looked up at her, his eyes dark and calculating. "You're still not used to this," he said, his voice low. "But you will be. Soon enough." Emily didn't respond. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was trapped. "I've been patient with you," Aleandro continued. "You're strong, I'll give you that. But there's only so much resistance I'll tolerate." He set the glass of whiskey down on the desk and leaned forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "You'll learn to respect my rules," he said, his voice taking on a darker edge. "I don't have time for stubbornness. You're here because I chose you, and you will stay here until I say otherwise." Emily's stomach churned. She didn't want to be here, didn't want to be a part of whatever plans Aleandro had for her. But she had no choice. The walls of his world were closing in around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "You're going to help me," Aleandro said, his voice suddenly softer. "And in return, I'll give you something you've never had before. Control." Emily's heart skipped a beat. Control? She didn't know if he was lying or if he was trying to manipulate her, but she didn't trust him. Not one bit. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Aleandro's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's the right question," he said. "And soon enough, you'll have all the answers you need." Emily didn't know if she was more afraid of the answers or the questions themselves. Either way, she knew she was in. Too deep. The choices she had once thought were hers had been taken away. And now, she was playing a game she didn't understand, with a man whose every word made her skin crawl. Emily spent the next few days in a constant state of unease. The mansion had started to feel like a gilded cage. Its vast rooms, marble floors, and dark hallways all seemed to mock her, reminding her that she had no control. Aleandro's presence was everywhere, and she could feel the weight of his eyes on her whenever he was near. It wasn't just the physical walls of the mansion that kept her trapped. It was the invisible ones Aleandro had built around her. She had tried to defy him, tried to show that she wasn't intimidated, but each attempt only seemed to make her situation worse. Every time she walked past one of his men or saw him in a room, his gaze seemed to strip her bare, reminding her that she wasn't safe. He had made it clear she wasn't leaving unless he said so, and that thought gnawed at her every second. Her meals were brought to her in her room, and the few times she ventured downstairs, it was always under the watchful eyes of the guards. No one spoke to her unless it was one of Aleandro's men giving her orders. She tried to tell herself it wasn't so bad. After all, she wasn't locked in a cell, and there was no immediate danger. But the longer she stayed, the more she realized how carefully everything was designed to control her. Aleandro didn't have to physically restrain her. He controlled her with his presence, his words, his rules. One afternoon, as Emily sat by the window of her room, trying to distract herself from the overwhelming sense of helplessness, the door to her room creaked open. She looked up, her heart racing. Aleandro stepped in, his eyes locked onto hers. There was no mistaking the cold authority that radiated from him. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice calm, "about what comes next." Emily stiffened. She had been dreading this moment, the moment when he would tell her exactly what he wanted from her. "Next?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me, Aleandro?" He walked toward her, not answering immediately. Instead, he took a seat. In the chair across from her, his gaze never leaving her face. "What I want," he said slowly, "is for you to understand the world you've entered. My world. You've been playing by your own rules, but now you're in mine." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She had never been good at being controlled, never been good at following orders without question. But Aleandro had made it clear that the stakes were different now. She wasn't dealing with just anyone. This man had power, more power than she could even fathom. "And what if I don't want to play by your rules?" she asked, her voice stronger than she felt. Aleandro smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then you make things more difficult for yourself. You make things more difficult for everyone around you." He paused, watching her closely. "But that's your choice." Emily was silent for a moment, processing his words. She had spent so much time trying to figure out a way out of this, trying to hold on to some semblance of control, but she had no idea how to fight back. She couldn't just walk away from this world. And no matter how much she hated it, she couldn't ignore the fact that Aleandro was always 2 steps ahead. "I don't know what you want from me," she said finally, "but I'm not going to be your puppet. I won't just do whatever you say." He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I don't need a puppet, Emily," he said. "I need someone who understands that in my world, there are no choices. There is only survival. If you want to survive here, you'll have to make a choice. Play by my rules, or face the consequences of disobeying them." The words sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't making an offer. He was making a threat. Emily stared at him, her mind racing. She had been trying to keep her distance, trying to stay strong, but every word he said seemed to wear her down bit by bit. She had never felt so small, so helpless. "I don't want to be part of your world," she whispered, her voice trembling. Aleandro stood up and walked over to her, his presence overwhelming. "You don't have a choice," he said softly. "You're already in it, whether you like it or not." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. He was right. She had no choice. She was trapped. Aleandro's eyes lingered on her for a moment, and then he turned and walked toward the door. "You'll come to understand soon enough," he said over his shoulder. "This is just the beginning." As the door closed behind him, Emily felt a sense of isolation unlike anything she had ever experienced. She had been trapped in this world with no way out. The mansion, the men, Aleandro's cold, calculating control. It was all part of a plan that she couldn't understand. But she would have to learn, whether she wanted to or not. And the thought terrified her. The next few days felt like a slow, suffocating descent for Emily. The mansion, once a grand symbol of wealth, now felt like a prison. Each room she wandered through seemed to echo with the weight of her thoughts, the silence pressing down on her. She had been here for what felt like an eternity, yet every new corner she turned made her feel more and more trapped. Aleandro was always nearby, his presence constant and unyielding. She could feel his eyes on her even when he wasn't physically around, the oppressive power of his control lingering in the air. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched at every moment. It wasn't just the physical surveillance, guards posted around the property, his men moving like shadows, but something deeper. Aleandro had a way of making her feel like she was always under his scrutiny, even when he wasn't speaking. Every time he spoke to her, it felt like he was measuring her, calculating how much longer she would resist. She had spent the last few days trying to keep a sense of normalcy. She read books in the library, walked through the gardens, and ate meals alone in the enormous dining hall, but nothing felt the same anymore. The life she had known was slipping further away with every passing hour. The worst part was the uncertainty. Aleandro kept his promises vague, his words cryptic, and though he made it clear she wasn't leaving, he never explained exactly why. Emily had no idea what he wanted from her, what role she was supposed to play in this twisted world he had created. But it was clear she wasn't just a prisoner. She was a pawn. One evening, as Emily sat by the fire in the sitting room, trying to escape her thoughts, the door to the room opened. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. Aleandro's presence filled the room like a storm, powerful and overwhelming. "Emily," he said softly, his voice low and smooth, "come with me." She stood without hesitation, though every fiber of her being wanted to refuse. She had learned that resisting him only made things worse. Aleandro didn't just command respect, he demanded it. And when he spoke, it was impossible to ignore him. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice steady, despite the unease creeping up her spine. Aleandro didn't answer immediately. He simply walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. Emily followed, her heart racing. They walked through the mansion, past the marble columns and over the cold floors, until they reached a large set of double doors. Aleandro opened them, revealing a room unlike any she had seen before. It was a vast, dark space with a single long table in the center. Around the table sat several men, all dressed in suits that looked expensive enough to be weapons in themselves. They didn't look up when Aleandro entered. Instead, they continued their quiet conversation, a low murmur of voices that stopped abruptly when they saw Emily. "Sit," Aleandro said, his voice sharp. Emily obeyed, sitting at the far end of the table, far from Aleandro, though she felt the eyes of every man on her. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. "This is where business happens," Aleandro continued, looking down at the papers scattered across the table. "But you won't be joining in." "Not yet." Emily didn't know if she should be relieved or worried. What did he mean by that? She had no idea, but she wasn't sure she wanted to find out. She tried to make herself as small as possible in her chair, but it was impossible to ignore the fact that she was the only woman in the room. The men continued their discussion, but it was clear they were no longer talking about business. Their eyes would flicker toward her, and she could feel the weight of their gaze on her skin, as if they were measuring her, judging her. "She's here to learn." Aleandro's voice cut through the tension, sharp and cold. "To understand how we work." Emily's stomach twisted. She didn't want to learn. She didn't want to be part of this. But the truth was, she had no choice. Aleandro was right. She was in his world now. And no matter how much she fought it, she was going to have to play by his rules. The meeting dragged on for what felt like hours. Emily sat there, trying to block out the conversation around her, focusing instead on the cold, empty space that seemed to grow larger and larger with each passing moment. But every time she looked up, Aleandro's eyes were on her. He wasn't speaking to her directly, but his gaze never wavered. He was watching her, studying her, waiting for something. After what felt like an eternity, Aleandro finally stood up, the movement cutting through the heavy air. "You'll be staying here tonight," he said, his tone final. "Tomorrow, we'll begin your lessons." Emily's heart sank. She didn't know what he meant by lessons, but she knew she wasn't ready for whatever was coming next. She wanted to argue, to scream, to demand answers, but she couldn't. She was too afraid. Aleandro didn't give her a chance to speak. He turned to the men at the table, giving them a curt nod. "You're dismissed," he said, and they immediately stood, filing out of the room without another word. Aleandro turned back to Emily, his expression unreadable. "Get some rest," he said, his voice softer now. "Tomorrow, you'll learn how to be useful to me." Emily's blood ran cold. She didn't know what that meant, but she knew it was nothing good. She stood up and followed him out of the room, her mind racing with 1,000 questions she couldn't answer. All she knew for sure was that she was still stuck in Aleandro's world, and the longer she stayed, the more impossible it seemed to escape. The next day, Emily woke up to a world that felt more suffocating than ever. The luxurious room she had been given was no comfort. It felt like another cage, just as the rest of the mansion had started to feel. The heavy velvet curtains blocked out the sun, casting the room in a perpetual gloom. She had tried to sleep, but the fear and uncertainty had kept her tossing and turning through the night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Aleandro's piercing gaze, his words echoing in her mind. "You're here to learn," he had said. "You'll understand soon enough." Emily didn't want to learn. She didn't want to understand the rules of his world. She didn't want to be a part of it. But that choice had been taken from her the moment she crashed into his SUV. Now, here she was, a pawn in a game she couldn't even begin to understand. She sat up in the bed, pushing her tangled hair out of her face. She felt like she had no control over her life anymore. She had been stripped of her freedom, her choices, her identity. All she had left was the cold, calculated world Aleandro had dragged her into. Her mind raced as she thought about the conversation she had overheard in the meeting room the day before. Aleandro had spoken to the men around the table like they were nothing more than tools to be used, his voice calm and steady, as if he controlled everything. And in many ways, it seemed like he did. She had no idea what kind of person Aleandro was, or what kind of empire he had built. But she knew one thing. She was stuck in the middle of it now, whether she liked it or not. The thought made her stomach churn. What did he expect from her? Was she just going to be another piece of the puzzle in his world? Or was there something more sinister at play? Before she could even attempt to process her thoughts, there was a knock on the door. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know who it was, but the sudden sound made her feel even more trapped. She stood up, her legs still shaky, and opened the door. It was one of Aleandro's men, the one with the dark hair and the stern expression. "Aleandro wants to see you," he said flatly. Emily nodded and followed him down the hall. Her footsteps echoed in the empty corridors, the sound almost as oppressive as the silence in the house. The guards stationed in every corner of the mansion seemed to be watching her every move. She couldn't escape, not even if she tried. They walked in silence until they reached the same study Aleandro had called her to the night before. The door was open, and the low murmur of voices from inside told her that Aleandro was already speaking with someone. The man who had escorted her knocked on the door before stepping aside. "Emily," Aleandro's voice called from inside. "Come in." She stepped into the room, and once again, the weight of his gaze was on her immediately. Aleandro was standing by the large desk, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, watching her carefully. He was speaking to another man, one she didn't recognize, but when he saw Emily enter, he stood up and excused himself, leaving the two of them alone. Aleandro motioned for her to sit. "Take a seat, Emily," he said smoothly, his voice like velvet. "We have some things to discuss." Emily didn't hesitate this time. She walked over to the chair opposite him and sat down, her heart pounding. She had no idea what he wanted from her, but she could feel the tension building in the air. Aleandro studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You've been here for a few days now, and I imagine you're wondering what happens next," he said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "I don't want to keep you in the dark any longer. I have a job for you." Emily frowned. "A job?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "You've got to be kidding me." Aleandro raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "I'm not kidding," he said. "You're going to help me with something. I need someone who can think for themselves, someone who can handle a little pressure. And I think you're perfect for the job." Emily's stomach dropped. "I don't want any part of your world," she said firmly. "I didn't ask for this. I just want to leave." Aleandro's lips curled into a smile, but there was nothing warm about it. "I understand that this isn't easy for you," he said, his tone almost condescending. "But the reality is that you don't have a choice. You're in my world now, and whether you like it or not, you're going to have to play by my rules." He walked around the desk and stood in front of her, his eyes locked on hers. "But don't worry," he said, his voice almost soothing. "I'm not completely unreasonable. You'll have some freedom here, but it will be on my terms. If you want to survive in my world, you'll need to understand that." Emily swallowed hard. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aleandro smiled again, but this time, there was a dark gleam in his eyes. You'll find out soon enough, he said, his tone slipping back into the cold, calculating voice she had grown used to. For now, just remember, you belong to me, Emily, and you will do as I say. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, but there was no way to avoid the truth. She had no choice. She was in his world now, and if she wanted to survive, she was going to have to play along, at least for now. But deep down, Emily knew one thing. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. The next few days followed the same unnerving routine for Emily. She woke up each morning in the same room, ate her meals alone, and spent her time pacing through the mansion, trying to make sense of the situation. The weight of Aleandro's words hung over her like a dark cloud, reminding her that she wasn't free. She was still trying to grasp the full extent of what he wanted from her. He hadn't exactly been clear about what his job for her was, only that she was going to be useful. But how could she be useful in this strange, oppressive world he had placed her in? What did he expect her to do? One evening, as Emily sat on the terrace overlooking the perfectly manicured gardens, she felt the familiar, suffocating presence of Aleandro approaching. She had learned by now to expect him at any moment, and his shadow fell across her before he even spoke. Emily, he said softly, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of power. She turned to face him, the knot in her stomach tightening. He stood there, looking every bit the imposing figure he was, tall, dressed in an impeccable suit, his gaze unwavering. Come with me, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She stood up, following him without protest. She had learned that it was better to comply, at least for now. He led her through the grand hallways of the mansion and into a room she had never seen before. The door closed behind them with a quiet click. It was a small, private office, far removed from the grandiosity of the rest of the mansion. The only furniture in the room was a large desk and a few chairs. It felt almost too intimate, and Emily's unease grew. Aleandro walked to the desk and sat down, motioning for her to do the same. She sat across from him, her eyes focused on the polished surface of the desk, avoiding his gaze. She didn't want to see the calculating look in his eyes. I'm sure you've been wondering what your role here is, Aleandro began, his voice steady, but somehow more intense than usual. You've been kept in the dark long enough. Emily looked up at him, her heart racing. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aleandro leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling in front of him as he regarded her thoughtfully. I need someone who can think. Someone who can observe, learn, and eventually make decisions that will benefit the people I work with. Emily frowned. You want me to make decisions for you? Not just any decisions, Aleandro said, his voice lowering. I want you to learn how to navigate this world, how to understand the power dynamics, how to anticipate what comes next. I need you to be someone I can trust. Emily felt a mixture of disbelief and confusion. I don't know anything about this world, she said, shaking her head. I don't know how to be what you want me to be. Aleandro's eyes softened, just slightly, but the intensity in his gaze remained. That's why I'm here, he said, his voice almost gentle. I'm going to teach you. I'm going to show you how to survive here. She couldn't decide if she was relieved or terrified. What did he mean by surviving? Was she going to be a part of his operations? Was this what he had meant when he said she was useful? The thought made her sick to her stomach. She wasn't sure she could do anything that would align with his world. I don't want to be part of your world, she said, her voice more forceful this time. I don't want to help you. Aleandro's expression remained unchanged, though his eyes darkened slightly. It's not about what you want, Emily. It's about what you'll do to survive. You may not want to be part of it, but you're already in it. You'll learn, whether you like it or not. The finality in his words sent a chill down her spine. She was stuck. There was no denying it. Aleandro's world was dangerous, filled with people who had no hesitation in doing whatever it took to get what they wanted. She had seen that in the way his men moved, the way they acted like they had no conscience, no limits. She had no idea how she would fit into this, but she knew she didn't have the luxury of refusing. Aleandro leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk, his gaze intense. You'll start your training tomorrow, he said. You'll begin learning the ins and outs of how we operate, how the business works, how to deal with people in power. You will be a part of my world, whether you accept it or not. And in time, you will understand why I chose you. Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had no idea what she had just agreed to, But one thing was certain. She couldn't back out now. She was in it. And the more she tried to resist, the more she felt herself being pulled deeper into Aleandro's world. The door opened behind her, and one of Aleandro's men stepped in. "Everything is ready," the man said. Aleandro nodded, standing up. "Good," he said. "Emily, this is your new reality. Get used to it." As he walked out of the room, Emily sat there in stunned silence, her heart sinking. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, how was she going to survive in this world she had no part of? The following day, Emily found herself at the edge of the unknown, stepping into a world she never thought she would be a part of. It felt like she was walking through a fog, unable to see what lay ahead, but knowing that the path had already been chosen for her. She had spent the night trying to gather the courage to face whatever Aleandro had planned for her, but deep down, she knew there was no way out. The mansion had become her prison, and every room, every hallway, every corner she turned felt like a reminder of that fact. As the morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, she knew it was time. Aleandro had already told her that today would be the beginning of her training, and she had no choice but to follow. There was no more resistance. The longer she stayed, the more she realized that she was either going to sink or swim in this world. And if she wanted to survive, she had to learn quickly. She stood up from the bed and dressed in the clothes that had been laid out for her. Simple but elegant, a reflection of the life she was now expected to lead. She walked out of her room, the guards watching her every step as she made her way down the long corridors of the mansion. As she entered the central hallway, she was met by one of Aleandro's men, a tall, silent figure who simply nodded at her and gestured for her to follow. Emily followed him through the mansion, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She had no idea where they were going, but she knew better than to ask questions. The man led her to a large, windowless room that was filled with maps, documents, and various pieces of equipment she didn't recognize. The room felt cold and clinical, completely different from the warmth of the mansion's other rooms. Aleandro was standing at a large desk, his back turned as he examined a set of papers. He didn't look up as Emily entered, but the air in the room seemed to shift the moment she stepped inside. The man who had brought her in quietly closed the door behind her and left the room, leaving Emily alone with Aleandro. "Sit," he said without looking up, his voice commanding, and without hesitation, Emily took a seat across from him. The room was filled with a quiet tension, and the weight of Aleandro's presence seemed to fill every corner. "I've been watching you," Aleandro said suddenly, his voice as smooth as ever. "I know you've been resisting me, but you need to understand something." He turned to face her, his dark eyes cold and calculating. "You don't have a choice. This is the world you're in now, and you'll either learn how to navigate it, or you'll be crushed by it." Emily swallowed hard. She had heard those words before, and each time they left a chill running down her spine. But there was something different about the way he spoke this time. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. She was already in too deep. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with the fear she couldn't hide. Aleandro studied her for a moment before walking over to the wall, where a large map of the city was pinned. He ran his finger along a few marked locations, as if lost in thought, before finally looking at her. "I need someone who can think on their feet," he said. "Someone who can learn quickly and make decisions that benefit the people I work with. You have potential, Emily. I saw it the moment I laid eyes on you." His words hit her like a punch. She had been nothing more than a mistake, a consequence of her own actions. She had no intention of staying here, but now Aleandro was telling her she had potential, that he saw something in her that could be of use to him. "I'm not going to be your pawn," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound confident. Aleandro didn't seem to be bothered by her words. In fact, he smiled slightly, a cold, calculating smile that made her heart race. "You already are," he replied, "whether you like it or not. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. If you work with me, if you learn what I'm going to teach you, you can gain something more. Power, control, freedom." Emily stared at him, not sure if he was lying or if there was some truth to his words. Could she really gain something in this world, or was she destined to be nothing more than a tool in Aleandro's hands? She didn't know, but she knew she had to survive. "So what's the next step?" she asked, her voice quieter now, less defiant. "The next step," Aleandro said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, is understanding what it means to belong in this world, to understand how to move through it, how to use it to your advantage. He walked over to a table covered in files, picked up a folder, and handed it to her. "Start with this," he said. "Study it. Understand who the players are, where they operate, and how we can use them to our advantage." Emily took the folder from him, feeling the weight of it in her hands. This was it. This was what her life had become. She was being trained, whether she wanted it or not, to be part of something she didn't understand. But the reality was clear. She had no choice. She had to learn. She had to adapt. And if she wanted to survive in Aleandro's world, she would have to play by his rules. Aleandro stepped back, his gaze never leaving her as she looked over the folder. "I'll be watching," he said softly. "Don't disappoint me, Emily." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts, the folder in her hands, and the heavy realization that her life had just taken an irreversible turn. Emily sat in the study, the folder Aleandro had handed her resting heavily in her hands. The room felt colder now, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. The soft hum of the mansion's security system was the only sound that kept her company, and she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that the world around her was spinning, changing in ways she wasn't ready to understand. She opened the folder, her fingers trembling slightly, and began flipping through the pages. Inside were documents, names, addresses, schedules, and photographs of men and women she didn't recognize, but the one thing they all had in common was Aleandro. He was connected to all of them in some way. Each page held a new piece of the puzzle, but the more she read, the more overwhelmed she felt. The people in these photos weren't just business partners or associates. They were part of something larger, something dangerous. She knew that if she continued down this path, she would be tied to this world, whether she wanted to be or not. And yet, she couldn't stop herself from reading. Power, control, freedom. The words echoed in her mind, repeating the mantra that Aleandro had spoken to her the day before. She hadn't wanted to accept it, but now, as she pored over the documents, she realized something. This was her reality now. She had no way of turning back. If she wanted to survive, she needed to understand how to navigate this world, and that meant learning how to wield the power that Aleandro had promised her. The more she read, the more she understood how high the stakes were. This wasn't just about business. It was about control over people, over entire cities, networks of influence that reached far beyond what Emily could have imagined. Her mind raced as she flipped through the last few pages, each one more unsettling than the last. Aleandro's influence seemed to stretch into every corner of the world she had once known, and the deeper she went into this life, the harder it would be to escape. She set the folder down on the desk and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Her head was spinning. The lines between right and wrong seemed to blur the longer she stayed here. This world was built on manipulation, power, and fear, and she was starting to understand that very clearly. She had tried to resist, tried to fight, but Aleandro had shown her one thing. There was no room for weakness in this world. Emily stood up, pacing the room, her thoughts racing. She had been given a choice, or so Aleandro had told her. Learn, survive, and use the power she had been handed, or fail. But what did that mean? She had seen how Aleandro operated, how he controlled every aspect of his empire with ease, how his men followed his orders without question. It wasn't just about money or influence. It was about control over people, over situations, over destinies. Could she really become part of this? Could she learn to navigate a world so far removed from the life she had once known? Emily stopped pacing, standing still for a moment to collect her thoughts. She looked out the window, staring at the manicured gardens stretching out before her. The mansion was beautiful, yes, but it was also a cage, and she was its prisoner. She had no illusions about what was happening here. Aleandro had claimed her, had dragged her into his world, and now she had to make a choice. Play by his rules, or become another casualty of his empire. She didn't know if she could do it, if she could really become the person he wanted her to be. But deep down, she understood that there was no way out. The mansion, the guards, the men who watched her every move, it was all designed to keep her in line. Aleandro had built this world with precision, and she was just one more piece in his carefully planned game. As she looked at the documents, the faces of the people who were part of his network, something inside of her shifted. She wasn't just a victim of Aleandro's world. She was a part of it now. And if she wanted to survive, if she wanted to find any way to regain control, she had to learn how to play the game. The thought was terrifying. She didn't want to become like them. She didn't want to lose herself in this world of power and corruption. But as she stared at the pages before her, the weight of the decision pressing down on her, she realized that she didn't have a choice. She could either fight back and risk losing everything, or she could accept the role that had been handed to her. It wasn't much of a choice, not really, but it was the only one she had. Emily exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing in determination. She wasn't going to let Aleandro break her. She was going to learn, and she was going to survive, no matter what it took. The door opened suddenly, interrupting her thoughts. Aleandro walked in, his presence commanding the room, and his cold, calculating gaze locked onto hers. "I trust you've been going over the material," he said, his voice low and smooth. Emily met his gaze, not showing any sign of weakness. "I've been studying," she replied, her voice steady. Aleandro smiled slightly, though there was no warmth in it. "Good," he said, "because you're going to need everything you've learned. Things are about to get more complicated." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. What did he mean by that? She had no idea, but she knew one thing. Nothing in Aleandro's world was ever simple, and she was only just beginning to understand the true cost of her involvement. The following days brought a new, unsettling rhythm to Emily's life. The mansion felt less like a prison now, but more like a place where she had to constantly prove her worth. Aleandro's words echoed in her mind every moment she spent inside its walls. "Things are about to get more complicated," he had said. Emily had no idea what he meant, but she could feel the tension building with every passing hour. Every time she interacted with Aleandro, it was like stepping through another layer of a world she wasn't prepared for. She could sense the power that emanated from him, the way he controlled everything with a few simple words. But what truly unsettled her was how easily he moved through the mansion, like it was his kingdom, and she was just a piece in it. The people who worked for him, his men, his associates, didn't speak to her much. They only watched. She often caught their eyes on her as she walked through the hallways, their gazes cold and calculating, as though they were constantly measuring her, evaluating how well she fit into the mold Aleandro had created. It was suffocating. But despite all of this, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was learning, not just from the documents Aleandro had given her, but from the way he interacted with everyone around him. She had started to observe more closely. Aleandro never raised his voice, never lost control. He was always calm, collected, moving with a quiet confidence that made everyone around him listen. That was power, and Emily was beginning to see it. She was beginning to understand how he worked. A week had passed since Aleandro had given her the folder, and she had spent the time learning everything she could about the empire he had built. The names, the faces, the network of businesses and connections, it was all starting to make sense. But it also terrified her. The more she learned, the more she realized how deep she was in. She was part of this now. She was learning how to use the power she had been handed, and it terrified her to think of what she would become if she kept going down this path. But despite the fear, Emily also couldn't deny that there was something intoxicating about it. Power, control, influence. It all sounded like something she had been searching for her entire life, even if she had never wanted to admit it. The more she learned, the more she felt like she was taking control of her own fate, even if it was under Aleandro's watchful eye. One evening, after another long day of studying the files and learning the ins and outs of Aleandro's world, Emily found herself in the library, staring out of the window at the sprawling grounds of the mansion. The evening was dark, and the soft hum of the mansion's heating system was the only sound in the room. She was alone, a rare moment of peace amidst the chaos of her life. She closed the file she had been reading, her mind racing with all the new information she had absorbed. It was too much to process, too much to understand all at once, but she couldn't stop herself from thinking about it. She had learned the names of the people Aleandro worked with, the deals they had made, the rivals they had crushed. She had even begun to understand the subtle dynamics of power, how to manipulate situations to get what she wanted. It was all part of the game, and she was starting to play it. "You've been busy," Aleandro's voice cut through the silence, making her jump slightly. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his presence as commanding as ever. He didn't move toward her, but the intensity in his gaze was enough to make her feel like he was in the room with her, surrounding her. "I've been reading," she replied, trying to sound casual, though she knew he could see right through her. Aleandro raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth curving into a slight, knowing smile. "I can see that," he said. He stepped into the room, closing the distance between them. "But do you understand what all of this means?" Emily hesitated for a moment before replying. "I think I'm starting to." Aleandro's smile deepened, but there was something cold in his eyes. "Starting to," he repeated. "Good. But you have a long way to go. Knowledge is power, Emily. But power without control is chaos. And chaos is dangerous." He was standing close to her now, so close that she could feel the heat radiating off his body. She held her ground, even though she could feel the intensity of his presence pressing down on her. "What happens when I have control?" she asked, her voice steady, though she couldn't help the way her heart skipped a beat. Aleandro's smile faded, and his gaze turned more serious. "When you have control," he said softly, "you can make people bend to your will. You can shape the world around you. But it comes at a cost." He paused, studying her. "The cost is loyalty, obedience. You give yourself over to the world you've entered, and you don't get to leave. There's no going back." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The weight of his words sank in. This wasn't just about learning the rules. It was about becoming someone else, someone who played by the rules of this dangerous world. And that terrified her. She had always prided herself on being independent, on making her own decisions. But here, in Aleandro's world, there were no such luxuries. She was part of something much bigger, and the more she understood, the more she realized there was no escape. Aleandro studied her for a moment longer, as though reading her thoughts. "You don't have to worry about that yet," he said finally. "Right now, your job is to learn, to become someone who can move in my world. But the day will come when I will need you to take the next step. And when that day comes, you'll have to choose. To be with me, or against me." Emily's heart thudded in her chest. She didn't know what he was asking of her, but she knew one thing. There was no turning back now. She was already too far in, and the path ahead was one she couldn't see. But the question lingered in her mind. Would she be able to make the choice when the time came? Or would she be swallowed whole by the world Aleandro had created? The next few days passed in a blur for Emily, each one blending into the next with no clear distinction. She had started her training, as Aleandro had promised, but the more she learned, the more she realized how deep she had already fallen into his world. The documents, the names, the connections, each one felt like another chain binding her to a life she hadn't chosen. And yet, as much as she hated it, she couldn't stop herself from learning. It wasn't just knowledge for the sake of survival anymore. It was becoming an obsession. She had started to memorize the faces in the photographs, recognize the patterns in the businesses Aleandro controlled, and understand the delicate balance of power that kept everything in motion. But even as she learned, the weight of her situation pressed harder on her shoulders. She couldn't escape. And worse, the more she understood, the more she realized she wasn't just part of his world. She was becoming a part of his plans. Emily spent her evenings alone in her room, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of everything. The mansion felt even quieter at night, as though the walls were closing in on her, and she found herself staring out of the window, wondering how long she could keep this up. Every time she looked into Aleandro's eyes, she saw something new, an emotion she couldn't name, something more than just control, more than just power. And that scared her. She had started to see him not as the cold, calculating figure he presented to the world, but as something more complicated, more dangerous. But she couldn't let herself think about it too much. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. The moment she did, she knew she would be lost. One evening, after another long day of studying the ins and outs of Aleandro's empire, she found herself in the garden, walking slowly along the path that wound through the lush greenery. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden light across the grounds, and for a moment, she felt a sense of calm. It was fleeting, but it was enough to make her pause and take a deep breath. She hadn't realized how much she missed the outside world, the simplicity of life before she had entered Aleandro's world. But that was a thought she couldn't afford. She was in this now, and there was no going back. As she walked, she caught sight of one of Aleandro's men standing by the garden gate. He was watching her, his face unreadable. Emily knew better than to approach him, so she continued her walk, trying to ignore the feeling that she was being watched. But even as she tried to keep her mind focused on the beauty of the garden, she couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled in her chest. She couldn't stop thinking about Aleandro's words, the choice he had given her. You'll have to choose. To be with me, or against me. But what did that mean? Emily had no idea. She had been playing along, doing everything he asked, but every day felt like a step closer to something she couldn't control. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she wasn't just learning about Aleandro's world. She was becoming a part of it. The thought made her stomach churn. As she turned to head back toward the mansion, she found herself face to face with Aleandro. He was standing in the shadow of one of the tall oak trees, his expression unreadable. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she tried to remain calm. "I haven't been avoiding you," she replied, her voice steady. "I've just been busy." Aleandro took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Busy," he repeated. "I see." He looked down at the ground for a moment, his gaze thoughtful, before his eyes lifted back to meet hers. "You're learning well," he said, his tone almost approving. "But it's not enough yet." Emily swallowed, the weight of his words sinking in. "What do you mean?" she asked, unable to hide the nervous edge in her voice. Aleandro's lips curled into a slight smile, but it was cold, devoid of warmth. "You've learned how to survive in this world," he said, "but now you need to learn how to thrive in it." Emily's stomach tightened. "Thrive?" "Yes," Aleandro said softly. "I've given you the tools, but you need to start using them. You need to learn how to wield the power that's at your fingertips. You need to make yourself indispensable." His words were calculated, and Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of them. She didn't want to be indispensable to him. She didn't want to be a part of his world at all. "I don't want this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Aleandro stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have a choice, Emily," he said, his voice almost gentle, but there was an edge to it that sent a shiver down her spine. "You're already in it. You'll either learn to control it, or it will control you." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. He was right, she realized. She had no choice. She was trapped. But as much as she hated the idea, a part of her knew that Aleandro was right. The world he had shown her wasn't something she could walk away from. Not now. Not after everything she had seen, everything she had learned. She was a part of it, whether she liked it or not. And the sooner she accepted that, the sooner she would find a way to make it work for her. But the question still lingered in her mind. Would she ever be able to control it? Or would she be swallowed whole by Aleandro's world? Days passed, and Emily felt herself slipping deeper into the world Aleandro had forced her into. She had hoped, even prayed, that she would find a way out. But now it was clear, there was no escape. Every day was a step further away from the life she once knew, and every lesson she learned brought her closer to becoming someone she couldn't recognize. She had begun to understand the subtle power dynamics, the delicate threads that connected people, businesses, and actions within Aleandro's empire. She had learned how to manipulate situations, how to read people, and how to anticipate their next move. But no matter how much she learned, it always felt like she was just one step behind. As much as she tried to embrace this new world, to accept the reality Aleandro had imposed on her, a part of her resisted. She hated herself for it, hated the fact that she was slowly becoming a part of something she despised. But she had no choice. Every day, Aleandro's men watched her. They were always there, never far away, making sure she stayed in line, making sure she didn't stray too far from the path he had set for her. She had learned to keep her distance, to not trust anyone, not even the other members of Aleandro's inner circle. They were all just pawns in his game, just as she was. But she knew one thing. She couldn't afford to be a pawn forever. One night, after another grueling day of training, Emily found herself alone in her room, staring at the file Aleandro had given her. It was late, and the mansion was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. The file was full of information, names, schedules, and plans, and Emily had memorized it all. But tonight, something felt different. She didn't want to just learn about the world Aleandro controlled. She wanted to control it. She had always been a fighter, always independent, and the more she learned about Aleandro's world, the more she realized that this wasn't about surviving. It was about winning. She knew she had to make a choice, continue down the path Aleandro had set for her, or take control of her fate. But how? She couldn't just walk away. There was no escaping this world. The mansion, the guards, the men who followed Aleandro's every command. They were all watching her, waiting for her to slip up. The thought of crossing him terrified her. Aleandro was dangerous, and he had proven time and again that he had no patience for disobedience. But Emily was tired of being afraid. She had seen what Aleandro was capable of, but she had also seen the cracks in his empire. It wasn't perfect. No empire ever was. And maybe that was the key. Maybe the only way to survive in this world was to take the power for herself, to find the weakness in Aleandro's game and exploit it. Emily stood up, her heart racing. She knew what she had to do. She would play the game, but she would play it on her terms. The next day, she began her plan. It wasn't about brute force or rebellion. It was about subtlety, strategy. She began by studying the people around her, those who had been part of Aleandro's world for far longer than she had. She listened carefully to their conversations, picked up on their weaknesses, and found the places where their interests overlapped with hers. It was slow at first, building the trust of the people who could help her. But over time, she started to see results. She wasn't just learning how to survive anymore. She was learning how to lead. Aleandro noticed the change in her. He watched her more closely, his eyes narrowing whenever she spoke in meetings or interacted with his men. It wasn't a warm look. It was a look of calculation, of someone who saw a potential threat in the making. But Emily didn't flinch. She stood her ground, knowing that she was playing the game just as he had taught her. As the weeks passed, Emily grew more confident. She was starting to build alliances within Aleandro's circle, though she kept them carefully hidden. She knew that any misstep could lead to disaster. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was the one in control. But she also knew that Aleandro was always one step ahead, and he would never let her out of his sight for long. One evening, Aleandro called her to his study. The moment she stepped into the room, she could feel the tension in the air. Aleandro was sitting at his desk, his fingers steepled in front of him as he watched her approach. "You've been busy," he said, his voice low, but there was no warmth in it. Emily stood her ground, her heart pounding. "I've been learning," she replied, her voice steady. Aleandro's gaze narrowed. "Learning? What exactly are you learning, Emily?" he asked, his tone dangerous. Emily didn't flinch. "I'm learning how to survive in your world," she said quietly. Aleandro studied her for a long moment before standing up, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've done well," he said finally. "Better than I expected. But don't mistake that for approval. You're mine, Emily, and you will never forget that." Emily felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't back down. She was starting to understand how the game worked, and she knew one thing for sure. If she wanted to win, she would have to play it smarter than Aleandro, and that meant gaining the power he had promised her. The battle for control had only just begun, and she was ready to fight. But as she looked at Aleandro, the man who had claimed her as his own, she knew one thing above all else. She would never be his puppet again, not without a fight. In this gripping dark romance, Emily finds herself entangled in a world of power, control, and manipulation after an unexpected crash with a mafia boss, Aleandro. As she is pulled deeper into his dangerous world, Emily must navigate the complexities of a life she never wanted, where every choice she makes is a step closer to becoming a part of something dark and unforgiving. Through each moment, the tension in this dark romance builds as Emily learns the high stakes of surviving in this treacherous world. With every lesson Aleandro teaches her, she realizes that the game isn't about surviving, it's about power. As Emily struggles to maintain her independence, the battle for control intensifies, making her question whether she can ever escape the grip of Aleandro's world. In this dark romance, Emily must decide if she will bend to his will or fight for the freedom she once had. The line between being a pawn and becoming the queen is razor thin, and in this dark romance, Emily must confront the darkness within herself and the man who controls her destiny. Will she ever escape his influence, or will she become the master of her own fate in this dark romance.